So the first area of disorders we're going to be delving into is anxiety disorders. We're going to pick up with additional disorders next week. We're also going to talk about dissociative disorders very briefly. So when it comes to anxiety disorders, the main symptom is excessive or unrealistic worry and fearfulness. Now, I want to remind you of the 3 Ds here. The worry is excessive, so it's beyond the threat that's presented, meaning that it is deviant, it's unusual, and it's also worry and fearfulness, which is a source of distress. And this excessive or unrealistic worry and fearfulness leads to dysfunction because people engage in behavior to reduce their anxiety through excessive avoidance of the source of the worry and fearfulness. So limiting exposure to things that might trigger an anxious response, for example. Keep in mind, once again, we're talking about excessive and unrealistic worry and fearfulness. If you're concerned about catching a disease that's very harmful, it's very normal to be worried about it and to practice behavior to avoid catching that particular disease that's currently, once again, a very real threat. One way of thinking about excessive and unrealistic is that it's perfectly normal to be very, very anxious and fearful if you encounter a growling, snarling, enormous wolf while you're walking down a path in the forest. That's very anxious-inducing. If you experience that same level of fear when you encounter a very small, fluffy puppy that doesn't yet have its full teeth in, and you could hold in the palm of your hand, that would be considered to be unrealistic and excessive beyond the level of threat. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. One type of anxiety disorder, so these other things we're going to be talking about are all related to anxiety disorders. One type of anxiety disorder is a phobia. A phobia is irrational, persistent fear of an object, situation, or social activity. Now keep in mind at the root of this is irrationality. So once again, if you experience a swooping feeling in your stomach as you're leaning over the cliffs of Moher in Ireland, which are very high up, I've been there, then that's normal. If you are so afraid of heights that you can't walk up the stairs, that's when it becomes irrational and problematic. And phobias are, once again, at their heart, irrational. You're actually going to encounter a gentleman when we talk about therapies later who is deeply, profoundly afraid and disgusted by baked beans. I know it's silly to think about, to be so afraid of baked beans. It's like, why? They're baked beans. That's the whole point. It's irrational. That's what makes it a phobia. A distinct subcategory of phobia would be social phobia or social anxiety disorder, where people might fear interacting with others or being in social situations that might lead to a negative evaluation. So people who are high in social phobia fear the judgment of others and interacting with others because they might be embarrassed. They don't want to be judged. And that is so profound that they avoid contact with other people. Specific phobias are fear of specific objects, situations, or events. So something like a fear of heights, a fear of choking, a fear of spiders, those would be specific phobias. Now, each of these phobias has names that are associated with them. And sometimes people might use this as a form of trivia. But keep in mind that for people who are undergoing these phobias are very real fears to them that profoundly limit their ability to function on a normal basis and can lead to profound dysfunction when it comes to their ability to interact with other people. So whereas it might be a source of trivia and fun words to learn about, the people who live it can have a really rough time. The key thing here is that people who have phobias will actively engage in avoidance behaviors to try to avoid the source of that phobia, and often to an extreme amount. If you're so afraid of things that you don't leave your house, once again, under normal circumstances, we're taking into account context, everybody, then that would limit your day-to-day life. And so phobias lead to avoidance, which leads to dysfunction. Here's some examples of some classic phobias. Fear of being in a small enclosed space would be claustrophobia. Fear of heights would be acrophobia. And agoraphobia is fear of being in a place from which escape is difficult or impossible. People who have social phobia also often might have agoraphobia and might want to stay inside their house to avoid encountering other people, and because they want to be able to escape to someplace safe, and if they're in a public place, they can't do that as easily. Another type of anxiety disorder, so once again, this is within the umbrella of anxiety disorders. I'm going to draw a picture later if people have found that helpful. But under the umbrella of anxiety disorders will be panic disorder in addition to phobias. So panic disorder is another type of anxiety disorder. With panic disorder, you have what's known as a panic attack. And those panic attacks occur frequently enough to cause difficulty in adjusting to daily life. So let's talk a little bit about what a panic attack is like. A panic attack tends to be a very intense episode where multiple physical symptoms of stress are going on. It's a very intense fight or flight response where your entire system activates in response to what would otherwise be an extraordinary threat. But the key thing with panic attacks is that they occur without any precipitating factor. There is no threat present, but your entire system gets flipped on all of a sudden out of the blue, and you experience a severe reaction to nothing. People who undergo panic attacks often report that they feel like they're dying. It feels like you're undergoing a heart attack. In fact, fairly often when people admit themselves to the emergency room thinking that they're undergoing a heart attack, the physicians in question know to distinguish between what's a heart attack and what's a panic attack, because it's very often for people to confuse the two. It's a very intense, painful situation. It's also often very embarrassing when somebody undergoes a panic attack instead of a heart attack, and they call the ambulance and they go into the ER, and then the doctor says, oh no, it was just you panicking a little bit. People can get very embarrassed. And once again, when they have a panic attack in a public space, that can sometimes be a source of embarrassment. Once again, this is such an aversive experience that people often try to avoid triggering another panic attack. They often associate the panic attack with the circumstances under which it happened. So if it happened while they were driving, they avoid driving. If it happened in an elevator, they avoid elevators. People can very strongly associate a fear response with the circumstances they were surrounded by during that fear response. And they really try to avoid encountering that thing again out of a desire to avoid triggering a panic attack, even though that might not have been the reason they had a panic attack. They associate it with them. And people fear having the panic attack in public, so they avoid public places. So social phobia and agoraphobia often go hand in hand with panic disorder. People fear being in places that they can't escape from, and they fear being judged by other people if they have a panic attack in front of them. So panic disorder is very often comorbid with social phobia and agoraphobia. So another form of anxiety disorder would be generalized anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder is a constant low level of worry and anxiety that has no specific trigger and that lasts for a really long time. Now, once again, I would say context matters. If you're constantly a little worried and anxious in the current atmosphere, that's actually pretty normal. But if you have no trigger at all for that anxiety, but it's constant and you don't know where it's coming from, then that would be associated with generalized anxiety disorder. People who have generalized anxiety disorder can sometimes also experience stomach troubles and problems sleeping because of that constant low level of worry that they have that never really goes away. It's like you have a part of your animal brain that's saying something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong, but you don't really quite know what it is. So next we're going to talk about related disorders. So these are not considered to be anxiety disorders, but related to anxiety. So one disorder I wanted to talk about that's related to anxiety is obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is when you have intrusive, recurring thoughts or obsessions, that's the obsession part, that create anxiety that is then relieved by performing repetitive ritualistic behavior. So the thought is the obsession, the behavior that's accompanying it is the compulsion. I've actually linked to a poem reading from someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder as one of the additional videos that you can watch in this particular unit. He does use some vulgarity, but I think it's a really great portrayal of how challenging it can sometimes be to hold a relationship while you have a disorder like obsessive compulsive disorder. These intrusive thoughts are often incredibly troubling, and you can't necessarily get rid of them. They're very graphic, they're distressing. So for example, someone might have a very sudden, intrusive, unwanted thought of their parent dying horribly in a plane crash. And this might be something they just can't stop thinking about. It's really distressing and disturbing, and they don't want to think about it. It's a source of deep distress. They engage in the repetition behavior as a way to relieve the anxiety. So for example, someone might think, my mom's going to die horribly in a plane crash. I've got to count everything in the room, and if I count everything in the room, she won't do that. And so someone might feel a great deal of distress if their repetitious ritual is interrupted, because it could be almost as if something bad would happen if they didn't do that particular thing. They've got to start over again, and they feel as if that bad thing is imminent and a source of immediate threat. Ritualistic behaviors often involve cleaning, checking, and counting. So I've got to check to make sure that the stove is off, and I'm going to check it 5 times in a row or 10 times in a row. I've got to count things, everything that I encounter as I walk, or I've got to clean everything for hours and hours. The key thing is that this ritualistic behavior often is very time-consuming and can cause significant harm when it comes to things like excessive cleaning, and that it really interferes with one's ability to engage in everyday living. Oftentimes, when we think of obsessive compulsive disorder, we think about the ritualistic behavior, but we don't necessarily think about the origins of it that's intended to dispel anxiety that's created by the intrusive thought. Other disorders that are related to anxiety include acute distress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. So acute stress disorder is when somebody might have a traumatic event and have an enhanced stress response immediately following that traumatic event. So difficulty sleeping, reliving the memories of that particular event with a lot of detail, and enhanced startle reaction, a bit of paranoia, needing to be in the corner to see all of the things and not being comfortable with anyone behind you, and once again, some trouble being a little bit hostile and easily kind of angered or nervous would be acute stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is when these sorts of symptoms last for longer than a month. So it's considered to be fairly typical for someone to go through a challenge after trauma, and often their pattern falls into a very specific set of behaviors. And if those behaviors can persist for more than a month, then it's considered to be PTSD. And once again, folks with PTSD can often experience those same sort of symptoms: trouble sleeping, enhanced startle response, the need to feel as if you can escape from any given situation, intense recounting of the memories of the traumatic event. Another thing that can accompany PTSD is what's known as flashbacks. That's the intense recollection of the event, but avoidance of any sort of thing that would remind you of the source of trauma. So trying to avoid anything that might trigger a flashback, and also, once again, trying to keep people at arm's length. So distancing the self from others would be another thing that we often encounter with PTSD. Yes, and I've already talked about arousal, irritability, hostility, sleeping issues, and an enhanced startled response. So a trouble calming down. We've already talked about how calming down is used in neurotransmitters that are inhibitory. And so people who have PTSD are having trouble with their inhibitory neurotransmitters. They aren't able to turn off their worry and their anxiety as a result of their trauma. So when it comes to different perspectives inform us about what could be potential sources of anxiety. One is the notion that fear can be conditioned and reinforced. It's very easy for us to associate an emotion with a particular object or event, and we can very quickly tie those things together. Do you remember the story of baby Albert and his fear of white fluffy things? He was made to feel that fear because an unpleasant sound was played every time he reached out to touch a rabbit. It was very easy to create fear by associating that rabbit with that unpleasant sound. So fear can be thought of as a conditioned response, something that can be learned and then reinforced. The cognitive perspective would be focusing on how people who are anxious can interpret ambiguous stimuli as being more threatening and have irrational thoughts about those stimuli. We're going to talk a little bit more about irrational thoughts in just a little bit so you can contextualize it a little bit more in terms of what I mean by irrational thoughts. The sociocultural perspective would state that we can learn fear by observing others. One of my friends, for example, has a phobia of birds, and she was fearful that her son was picking up on her fear, that her son would learn the fear of birds from her and pick up on it, and as a result, his life would be a little bit less rich. So she tried very hard to make sure that he didn't pick up on her fear, so that she would be able to make sure that he wouldn't develop her phobia. The biological systems are focused on the heritability of anxiety and the heritability of certain types of neurological deficits that can make people more likely to have high arousal. Also how some people might be more susceptible to PTSD due to their biological makeup and how their fight or flight systems work. People might also be more susceptible to developing panic attacks, once again as a result of their biological predispositions and things like how their body processes stress and whether they have adequate amount of inhibitory neurotransmitters. So I wanted to just spend a little bit more time talking about the cognitive perspective when it comes to what I mean by irrational thinking. So here's some examples of specific types of irrational thinking when it comes to anxiety. The first is magnification, where situations are magnified in terms of their level of threat. Everything is far more dangerous, harmful, or important than it actually is in reality. That would be known as magnification. All or nothing thinking is where everything must be perfect or the results will be a failure. So someone can gain a sort of notion of an irrational thought that they must get 100% on the exam, or why bother taking it, and they can never get 100%, so I'm just not going to show up, right? So that notion of perfectionism can sometimes be present with anxiety and often depression as well. It's thought, for example, that people who hoard actually have a tendency towards perfectionism, where they desire a home that's perfectly clean and organized and can never reach that standard, and so descend into helplessness. Overgeneralization is where a negative event becomes indicative of defeat and failure. So a single negative job performance means that I will never succeed in anything ever, and this will never end, and I will always be a failure. So to tend to take that negative event and blow it out of proportion in terms of how frequently it occurs and its likelihood of occurring again. And minimization is where people tend to ignore their successes and to minimize how important those successes are. So if you got a really good job performance, oh, that's just a fluke. I'm sure next time around it'll show that I didn't do well at all. So to tend to overemphasize the negative and underemphasize the positive. The last thing I wanted to talk about was dissociative disorders, so we'll spend our last minute on that. Dissociative disorders are when you have a break in conscious awareness, memory, your sense of identity, or some combination. So this is a different type of disorder family than anxiety disorders. So we've talked about anxiety disorders, now we're moving on to dissociative disorders, which once again represent a break in your awareness, memory, or identity, or some combination. There are 3 different types of dissociative disorders I wanted to talk about. The first is dissociative amnesia. When you have dissociative amnesia, then you lose a sense of your memory for your sense of self. And this is either partial or complete. Often this is a coping mechanism for a potentially traumatic event or a great deal of stress, where sometimes some individuals can have a break of their identity where they can develop a sudden case of amnesia, where they don't remember who they are, as a coping mechanism for that extreme amount of stress. So for dissociative amnesia, this is a loss of memory that is not due to injury or disease. This is a purely psychological loss of memory. Dissociative fugue is where you have amnesia and also the strong desire to travel away from familiar surroundings. So sometimes people with dissociative fugue will just get in the car and drive and not necessarily remember who they are and just try to get as far away from their current situation. So this is a more extreme form of, once again, what's thought to be a form of coping with extraordinary stress or a traumatic event that can trigger a dissociative fugue for some people. And the last dissociative disorder is dissociative identity disorder, where a person seems to have two or more distinct personalities within one body. So people with dissociative identity disorder might often develop multiple personalities, once again, as a coping mechanism for extraordinary amounts of stress or a traumatic precipitating event. And these different personalities might help them cope with interacting with the world. Sometimes someone with dissociative identity disorder isn't necessarily aware that they have this disorder, but they are aware of missing time where the other so-called personality is taking over for them. And then they're made aware of the fact that they did actually interact with their environment and might have behaved in a way that was very different from their usual personality. Now, of course, there's all sorts of debate where people might go, well, is dissociative identity disorder real? Do people actually have multiple personalities within their body? And I would say that's less important to me, and it's more important to understand that for the person with dissociative identity disorder, that reality is very real for them. That experience is very real for them, and it's a very real coping mechanism to deal with a profound trauma that they might have experienced. So I think that's more important to focus on than whether someone can actually have these multiple personalities and whether that is real. I think for the person who's undergoing it, it very much is real, regardless of whether that's actually multiple people living within the same person. I think it's a very real form of reality for the person undergoing that particular disorder.